Welcome back, everyone. So, as our second lecture of this particular semester, I wanted to sort of give us a very cursory overview of a few important concepts related to the history, culture, and religion surrounding the field of domestic violence and our understanding of it. And I think right now, even though we're going to go much deeper into history, culture, and religion and how they intersect with domestic violence going forward in the semester, I think doing sort of this overview in this lecture, I think, is a really not just timely and important, but given our current state of the world with racial injustice and systemic inequality, unfortunately, against the background of a pandemic that seems to exacerbate a lot of these problems, I think taking a brief moment to remind us of no matter what we study, no matter what our passion's about, looking back and understanding the history, as well as doing our best to be open to understanding different cultures and religions, is something that is timely and it's always relevant, but I think right now it speaks volumes. So in this lecture, we're going to take a look, first of all, when we think about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, when did America first even recognize it as a problem? So we're going to do a little bit of a brief timeline of a couple key events that have happened over the last 100+ years that sort of got the ball rolling, and then we'll go deeper into those later. Also, I want to do a very cursory look at how have we typically addressed the problem of domestic violence over the last several decades, and how that we might still see a hole, a place that we can fill and improve our attempts to address the problem of domestic violence. And that one of the key things that is connected to that is this idea of cultural competency. And that's one of these terms that you're going to hear brought up throughout this course quite a bit. So we're going to go ahead and dive into these. The readings here, I know I already mentioned chapters 1 and 2 with the previous lecture, but those still apply here, as well as starting to look into chapter 3 of our textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. So when did America even start to consider this concept, this idea of domestic violence? Well, if you look at the history of America and you look at the history of a lot of nations around the world, prior to the 1860s to the 1880s, especially in married relationships, oftentimes the female spouse was almost seen as property of the husband. And so it was anything goes. As far as protecting children and things like child abuse, similar idea. They were seen and treated almost as mini adults who were the property of their parents. So when we think about the types of violence that occurred between men on women, or men and women on children, etc., there really weren't a lot of laws to protect them. Coming out of the Civil War and the decades that followed it, we did start to see sort of the first emergence of a recognition of this concept called domestic violence. And one of the things we can sort of trace it back to was what was known as the Court Watch in Chicago in 1885. And this was a group of individuals who came together, not in any overly formal manner to begin with, but as you can see from these bullet points, the idea was attending court, going to court, and monitoring the various legal proceedings that involved women and children. As I said before, at this time, women didn't have a lot of protections, especially when it came to their husbands in the court of law. And children, we didn't even have our first juvenile court until 1899. So at this time, 1885, children were once again sort of seen as mini adults. And now we understand differently when it comes to maturity and psychological processes that we need to recognize the differences with children. So this group, this Court Watch, went and monitored these proceedings to make sure that to look for evidence of impropriety or unfair treatment of these individuals. And when they recognized that, they would offer up legal aid as well as personal assistance to these women and their children. And through this, there was this growth of recognition that women and children oftentimes need something outside of simply the law, the cops and the courts to look out for them and protect them in cases of domestic violence. In fact, this Court Watch in Chicago in the mid to late 80s also was one of the first quote unquote women's shelters to be established. So the Women's Club of Chicago opened up a shelter that would help and provide aid to women and children who were facing situations regarding domestic violence. So this was some of our There are other examples going on throughout the country, but this is one of the ones that really sort of set the stage for what was to start to occur over the next 100+ years. Then the next major stop, and as I said before, we'll go back in time in a later lecture and go much more deeper into history, but I just want to hit some of the high points right now. So almost 100 years later, or a little bit less than that, St. Paul, Minnesota, 1972, a group known as the Women's Advocates, similar to what we saw with Chicago a century earlier, started to set up emergency housing shelters for these individuals, shelters for people to escape from an offender, even if they weren't in the legal system. They also worked within the community to proliferate the use of community-based services for women suffering from domestic violence. And this time period, the early 70s, coming on the back end of the civil rights movement, where there's a lot of change going on in America, this time period became known as the domestic revolution. And as we go forward in this course, and both in lectures and in your textbook, you're going to see references back to the domestic violence revolution multiple times. And so just sort of start to get used to the idea that this is something that grew out of the civil rights movement, and then a lot of these different reforms from a community point of view that started in the 1970s. So what were some of the outgrowths of the domestic violence revolution? Well, one of the key things is we started to see the criminalization of domestic violence. So we started to see more laws and statutes that were written with a specific focus on crimes of violence, assaults, etc., that were under this umbrella of domestic violence. So it was no longer just charging a husband or a boyfriend or somebody with, assault and battery or rape or sexual assault. Rather, there were specific laws that were sort of designed for the unique nature of domestic violence situations. So we finally started to see the growth of this. We also, within the community, we started to see sort of the proliferation of multiple agencies coming together to provide resources and help for victims of domestic violence. So we saw the mobilization of legal, health, and social services to start helping these victims. So we start to see the proliferation of women's shelters. We see nonprofit agencies that offer therapy and group sessions as far as health and resources and things of that nature. And then also, and this is kind of near and dear to my heart being sort of the researcher, this is when we also, in the early 70s, we really started to say, okay, we know what this thing about this domestic violence thing is, and it is unique, and it needs to be recognized, and it needs to be dealt with, but we need to figure out just how pervasive is it? What does it look like? What are the nuances of it? And so this is during this period is also where we started to see the real accumulation of larger data and research sets to understand this concept. And we had talked about the National Crime Victimization Survey and a few other surveys in our last lecture, and a lot of these really sort of started during the 70s and then into the 80s and 90s that sort of grew out of this domestic violence revolution. Then 1994, one other big historical thing that we should probably be familiar with is VAWA. VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act that went into effect on a federal level by President Clinton. And as you can read in this quote from our textbook, it was a nationally coordinated effort focused on the safety for victims and accountability for batterers, both to be achieved through some combination of arrest, prosecution, counseling, and the delivery of a broad, if poorly defined, range of community-based and traditional services. So what we see here is this is finally where we saw the United States, 1994, at a national federal level come forth, and the president signs into effect this act, which starts to identify we need to make sure we have various responses to this thing called domestic violence, because it is such a unique form of crime, a unique form of assault, deviance, control, etc. We need to take a look at it. And within this definition of it, you can see that there was sort of that legal side, the cops in the courts. But also there was this growth of community-based treatment and counseling and assistance for the actual victims. But you'll notice in this quote, and I have it underlined, our it's easier to write into law different statutes and have the cops and the courts enforce these policies and these laws. But something that is sort of as dynamic and ever changing as community resources and the limited budgets that often go with them, that was a little bit harder to define what exactly was needed. And part of this is where we're going to turn to. Part of it was in order to really assist victims of any sort of crime, but especially domestic violence, not every victim needs to be treated the same. And this is a key thing we want to make sure we think about as we go forward in this class. Each case is unique, but yet, as human beings and researchers, we like to categorize. We like to typologize. We like to say, oh, well, it was a case of this. It was, a married couple with this type of crime. Here's how we're going to help this particular victim. That doesn't always work. We need to understand unique things about the situation, but also about the culture and society that victim is coming from. And that's why we are still, several decades later, still trying to get better at providing and making available services to the wide variety of different victims of domestic violence, male to female, young to old, different race to different race, different religion to different religion. So when we think about how we've sort of addressed the problem, starting in 1990, well, actually starting well before then, in the 1970s with the domestic violence revolution, but really, as I stated, with the VAWA Act of 1994, we sort of, as a country, really put our foot down and said, we're going to treat domestic violence as a criminal behavior and punish it accordingly. If we do that, we can stop, right? Almost a very rational choice theory. As if we make the cost of hitting your spouse or doing some other sort of criminal behavior to your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, and that punishment is worse than the joy or whatever that you get out of doing it, you'll stop. Okay. That sounds good because we've had people crying out for, we need to have some sort of respect the victims. We need to make sure that they are being assisted. And one of those ways is to punish the offender, right? We see that in America today, calling for the arrest of somebody, calling for the prosecution of somebody. But within domestic violence, we've got to think it's a much bigger thing. So criminal behavior is good, but when we think about the duties, who's going to punish and monitor the offenders? The cops and the courts, right? So once again, I said that's something that can be done, at least on paper, pretty straightforward. And then supporting the victims, we're going to have to rely on domestic violence organization, community-based services, shelters, etc. So is much more tenuous. We've got to find ways to actually bolster the money, the support, the grants that go to these sort of community-based organizations. But with all of that, even with supporting the victims and punishing and monitoring the offenders, one of the things that has really come to light in the research about domestic violence over the last 10 to 15 years has been our lack of sort of understanding of different societies and different cultures, even within our own country. And as I said before, that is one of the things we want to keep in mind is really, if you want to understand how to help somebody, or if you want to understand how to reduce a certain type of domestic violence, we need to understand the nuances of what makes that particular crime or that particular case unique, and how can we be open-minded to help those individuals. All right, so that's what we see here on this slide. We do need the police, we need the courts, we need the victim services. I am not saying take those away at all. We need all of those. They need to be funded, they need to be organized, they need to be reviewed to make sure they're addressing the problem in the proper way. But we also need to think about structural and cultural sources of abusive behavior. And today we're just going to sort of go down this rabbit hole of thinking about cultural competency and structural and cultural factors that may influence different categories or groups of individuals. And we'll obviously go into much more detail down the line. But right now, because these are kind of abstract ideas, I want you to think to yourself, if I ask, like, what do I mean by structural and cultural factors that may influence abusive behavior? Right? Well, okay, when we look across different societies, one thing that's out there, a factor that may influence whether or not, the dynamic of a relationship is money, right? Do you have a lot of money, right? A couple that has a lot of money, maybe, but not always, maybe they're going to be less likely to be angry or frustrated about financial situations, or if somebody's spending a little bit more, things of that nature, right? People with very little money, you can imagine that may become a source of aggression, resentment, anger, things of that nature, which can lead to abusive behavior. Um, Also, think about relationships in the ever-growing melting pot of a world we have, with people coming to new countries or people from different cultures getting together in relationships. We have to think about language and cultural behaviors. And obviously, if you've ever traveled, that you feel like you are immediately a lesser citizen sometimes when you can't converse with the individuals around you, because all of a sudden you have a limitation, you have a handicap in that sense. We have things of that nature. Think about cultural things such as behavior. In some societies, people are taught from a young age, either male, female, whatever, to be aggressive, to be outspoken, to share their views. Other cultures, people from a young age are taught to be quiet, mind the elders, don't speak unless spoken to. And you can imagine these, as we start to do it, can become ways of which that may lead to the incitement of abusive behavior, or may lead to the underreporting of abusive behavior. And also, think about now, what if all of a sudden you are from a culture that is been taught to be soft spoken and reserved, and you come across a group of individuals that are raised from an environment where it was very boisterous and outspoken and loud. Now, you may take their behavior simply as anger and aggression when it's not. It's just a cultural dynamic. And these are the things that start to get into this idea of structural factors, cultural factors, and cultural competency. We think about other structure and cultural things. Things is like, what is your faith in? Is your faith more in science or in your church, in your religion? Right? So when you're thinking about who to talk to, if you're in a relationship where either you feel like you may be the aggressor or the victim, do you rely on science? Do you medicate your problems? Or do you go to your pastor at your church and trust them to lead you in the right way? And we need to understand not everyone's going to think and go the same direction, but we, as people who are going to work in this field and assist individuals who are victims of domestic violence and get to the root of the problem, we have to understand that not everyone's going to think the same way that we do, right? People across different cultures are going to have different levels of trust in the government, right? Do they feel confident calling the cops if something's going on? Do they feel that once they're working within the court system that they're actually going to be respected and be paid to? You have ways about their general, how do people in different cultures go about conflict resolution? Is it just turn the other cheek, or is it yell it out, right? And all these things can lead to a very fascinating dynamic, but it's something that the perpetrators need to understand, the victims need to understand, and especially the law enforcement officers who respond, people who work for the courts, attorneys, victim services individuals. Everyone across the spectrum needs to understand that people are different. And that in order to get that, we need to understand this thing called cultural competency. So, cultural competency has many, many definitions. And there's a link on here that comes from Georgetown that goes to, and it's a nice webpage that kind of like summarizes sort of the history and some of the major definitions of cultural competency that have come about over the last several decades. And cultural competency is going to be, once again, one of those sort of like key phrases that you're going to hear throughout this course. You're going to hear things like the domestic violence revolution. You're going to hear cultural competency all over again. In a couple of weeks, you're going to be hearing about coercive control. There's a lot of pet phrases. So we have to have some sort of introductory understanding of them before we dive into it. So let's take a look at sort of some of the key points that is seen in many definitions of cultural competency. And then on the remaining slides, we're going to take a look at various groups within society and see how maybe they may be misunderstood by other cultures or other groups, or they may feel that they need to respond in a certain way within this larger culture. And then in your mind, think about how that may lead to domestic violence and what are the connections. So for those individuals who want to proclaim that they have good cultural competency, there are sort of four basic principles that continue to come up. First is you've got to be an open-minded person. somebody who is culturally competent should value diversity, right? They should respect and actually think that it's cool if they're somebody who's a total meat eater and they meet somebody who's vegan or vegetarian, they shouldn't be thinking, "Oh my goodness, it's just another vegetarian." No, they should be go, "That's kind of cool." And maybe if they're going to ask questions, ask why. Does it make you feel better? Do you feel healthier? Is it for other reasons that you've chosen this route? And value that diversity, right? And if you're a person who tends to be a little bit shy and quiet, that's fine, but you should also be able to value those people who like to be out loud and like to be out front. And this is one of the key things, is not feeling like people who are different are bad. So valuing diversity in and of itself is sort of the starting point, being open-minded to different opinions, different sexualities, different tastes, different whatever. A second thing that I think of, the second bullet point that says having the capacity for cultural self-assessment. I think a key term that has been coming up in with a lot of things going on in the United States right now, and that I've been reading about and other stuff, is a key word I keep hearing is vulnerability. Can we be vulnerable? Are we willing to be vulnerable? Because only once you become vulnerable can you really look at yourself. Can you take criticism and then help it to modify you and change and become stronger. So through vulnerability, you hear lots of it. It can make you trust more. It can make you be stronger in the end. Well, that's kind of what this having the capacity for cultural self-assessment means. You have to be able to look in your own in the mirror, and can you sort of self-assess your implicit biases? The little things that make you go, "Oh, I can't believe that person ordered that to eat," or "Oh my God, what are they wearing?" Or "Oh, really, you like to listen to that type of music?" Right? Those little negative things you need to open up, because not everything that you think is the right thing, right? And people can be diverse, going back to the second one. So we want to be vulnerable and be open to even looking at ourselves in the mirror to figure out what are our biases and try to become better. A third thing about cultural competency is understanding that, yes, there is diversity. People are going to be different in their religious beliefs, in how they dress, and all these other things I've talked about. But when you bring two different cultures together in one setting, it's not just additive. It's not just 1+1, right? We have the modest, quiet folks meeting the, silly, outrageous, loud folks. It's not just 1+1. Instead, it is almost more of a multiplicative sort of thing. There's a dynamic that comes together when cultures interact. And one of the things about cultural competency is, do you as a person, or the people you run with, so to speak, have the ability to sort of navigate that minefield of, that every once in a while somebody may slip and say something that may be slightly offensive to the other group. Do you know how to, one, try to avoid such situations? And two, if a situation comes about, do you know how to sort of put out a fire and bring it down without instead exacerbating sort of the dynamics that's going to occur? And then finally is the idea of learning, reading, listening, studying, being willing to, watch movies from a different culture or nation or language to see how they depict, a comedy or a drama or a romance or whatever it may be. It means reading authors of different religions and political viewpoints and cultures as yourself, right? And understanding sort of that institutionalized cultural knowledge. Hear it from the people who are living it. Let them describe why their culture is this way, why they behave this way, and maybe we can all start to understand each other a little bit better. And instead of saying that person's being loud and aggressive because they're being rude and angry, no, maybe they're being loud and aggressive because they're scared. Maybe they're being loud and aggressive because growing up, the only way they could get their voice heard was to speak or interact in that way. And so there's oftentimes, like they say, two sides to every coin. So these four components, and we'll see these kind of come up, sort of are broad strokes of this idea of cultural competency. And then obviously in practice. So for anyone who goes into working with victims or offenders that are involved with domestic violence, you've got to think about whether you're providing a shelter, or you're providing legal services or advice, or you're a therapist. In practice, cultural competency means that you need to be able to adapt. how you engage with clients or individuals with the reflecting of the understanding of the cultural diversity that you learned with those top four things, right? So if you're a therapist, you have to realize, okay, who's coming in to talk to me today? And I may have a completely different approach. And just because you may be a therapist who was taught one way, this is how I get to somebody and how I get them to understand their problems and we can work it out, it's not going to be the same for everyone. And so a lot of this is being fluid, it's being dynamic, it's being able to, like being like water, I guess, right? Being able to adjust to the situation, do what you need, go with the flow in order to find the best outcome. Okay, so I kind of went long on that, and we'll see, but it is important because this term is something that is going to come back to us quite a bit. So let's take some looks at some various groups in society and see if you can sort of think about some of the structural factors that are inhibiting them or helping them, the cultural factors that may be different from what you know or what you grew up with, and then also see if you can think about being open-minded to understanding the diversity and seeing the world from their point of view. All right. So we'll start with the LGBTQ community. And once again, like I said, we will go into much greater detail about various groups. This is just one snippet of an example referring to the U.S. Transgender Survey of 2015. And they found that transgender people of color who completed the survey experienced deeper and broader forms of discrimination than white USTS, the survey respondents. And although they experienced higher rates of interpersonal violence, Black respondents reported less comfort reaching out to police, medical professionals, and shelters for help. Additionally, the lack of LGBTQ inclusive violence program prevention efforts and healthy relationship programming in most communities results in low levels of awareness of the prevalence and impact of domestic and sexual violence in the LGBTQ community. Okay, a couple things I think brought out that sort of help us with this idea of structural factors, cultural competency, etc. One is we're thinking of the idea of there's multiple things. One, it's to be a member of the LGBTQ community. We don't have to look very far in headlines in the media or go back in time to see the barriers and societal hurdles and the discrimination that a lot of these individuals have faced. But then we mix that with also being people of color, being a Black respondent. You're now sort of adding a second layer and another community that has faced widespread discrimination, racism, etc. And so one of the things we see in this is that a lot of us, we're not essential. We don't just have one characteristic, right? We all have multiple components to us. And if those multiple components, you're an individual who is of a historically marginalized group, then it's going to make it even worse. And you notice, oftentimes, a lot of these individuals, there's a lack of trust in police and medical professionals, so they're not going to reach out. Or if they feel like there's going to be bias or discrimination, they feel like it's not worth the effort. And then in some of these areas, if there's not the actual community outreach, that's another barrier that individuals are facing, right? So with this one, a lot of people could say, like, well, if you're the victim of this stuff, why don't you just call the cops? Why don't you go to the emergency room? Why don't you look up the local shelter? Guess what? As we see with this, not everyone are those safe havens or reliable resources. For some of these people, those are not the places they want to go. They, in their mind, in their experience, may actually make the whole situation even worse for them. And we need to be open to that. Another example would just be immigrants to this country in general. While there are differences in domestic violence experienced by immigrant survivors, there may be commonalities, such as patterns of abuse tied to the survivor's experiences as an immigrant, as well as challenges and barriers to seeking help. Limited understanding of issues related to the survivor's immigration status, eligibility for public assistance, different cultural practice, English language proficiency, etc. So that middle paragraph, I think, really captures a lot, right? These, once again, are individuals who may not be legally allowed in the country. Therefore, they may not be able to have access to public assistance. Given their cultural upbringing, that may be different than the general society or area that they're living in the United States. Their strength or lack thereof of English language is also going to be another cultural thing. And then it says at the end here, it is also essential to note the importance of using a strengths-based approach, recognizing the courage, strength, resilience, and perseverance of immigrants who have sought to establish a new life for themselves and their children in the United States. I personally love that last paragraph because I think it kind of captures another aspect of cultural competency that we don't really see, right? We think about like, okay, cultural competency. Okay, what was the definition? Oh, that's right. I need to be open to diversity. Cool. I've got to be vulnerable, look in the mirror to do self-assessment. Okay, cool. I need to know the institutionalized blah, blah. I need to know all this stuff. But right here, this is taking their status and looking at the other side of the coin. If we want to strengthen these survivors, if we want to help them, if we want to make them come out of this victimization an even stronger person, we're not going to necessarily always want to focus when giving assistance as focusing too much on their immigration status or trying to get them to speak English better right away. No, no, no. Rather, think about what made them strong to begin with, right? And as any immigrant who's ever, I mean, heck, for any of you who even moved a couple towns to go to college, you feel what it's like to make a transition in your life. You uproot yourself and it's different. Imagine, and some of you probably have close ties to this, imagine what it's like to go to a completely different country with a completely different culture and political system, a completely different language base, right? You need to have courage, strength, resilience, and perseverance. And this is, I think, a fascinating way to talk about how whenever we're seeing the individual, how do we turn and approach it in a way that will empower them, that will really get them help? Because I'm a big believer in one of the things I'm going to stress, the only way we can help victims and survivors of domestic violence is we need to make them stronger each day. And not everyone gets stronger by being yelled at or just simply given a list of resources. We need to focus on what made them get to this point in their life in the first place. And I mean the good stuff. They've reached a certain age. They're still walking and talking. And if they're doing that, then we can make them stronger. And then another one, looking at Latinx communities. And effective responses to this problem require culturally specific analysis with culturally relevant tools and approaches. Of equal importance is engaging communities to effectively respond to domestic violence. Understanding and honoring the great diversity that exists within Latinx or Latina communities is a key component in delivering effective interventions and trauma-informed responses to address the violence. Okay, the takeaway for this one is obviously, I think, when you're looking at the Latinx community, we're seeing a lot of, from a culturally point of view, there's certain ingrained cultures. There's oftentimes a heavy tie to religion. And religion can shape how people see the world and their willingness to accept or not accept different types of violence. There's also a gender-based dynamic that is unique to the Latinx community. But also, one of the things that I really appreciate with this, and especially for those of us in Southern California, there is not one Latinx or Latinx community out there. No. You have microcultures and very important microcultures within a much larger sort of group of individuals. And so, in many ways, we need to recognize that, yes, this person is identified as Latinx, but that's just the beginning. There is so much more uniqueness about where their family history came from and the cultures and the religions and the approaches to daily life that came from different countries, different parts of larger countries, etc. Okay. In this final one, rather than just having it typed out, I would like you to watch this video. And going through it, I would like you to keep in mind, look for those structural or cultural factors that she brings up. Think about how she implores us to be a little bit culturally competent and be open-minded to understanding how people behave and not reading it from our own implicit bias or our own implicit understanding of the world. Try to think about how we as individuals need to open our minds and maybe consider where that person's coming from doesn't always match our sort of rationale for why somebody may do something, say something, not say something, or behave in a certain way. And I think this is a really well done, it's a short little talk, and she goes through and lays it out. So take a look at this when you get the chance, and then we'll pick it up with our next lecture next week. Take care.